my benefit, in case I over-explain anything, has anyone here got any familiarity with these non-charitable purpose trusts? Yeah. So they are known, but they are fairly eclectic. As I say, the background for the talk, the theme for the talk, is the global industry in orphan structures. But starting off with the efforts of the G20 and the FATF, we know there's currently a global initiative to identify beneficial owners, and the mantra is that someone somewhere must know who owns something or everything. And that, of course, quite legitimately was the theme of the talk that immediately preceded mine. I don't believe that the political will behind beneficial ownership disclosure is what it appears to be. Worldwide, efforts are being made to implement enforcement mechanisms for identifying beneficial owners of companies and other legal persons, limited liability companies, foundations, and so on. And the policies that are driving these initiatives have been codified, have been subsumed in the G20 high-level principles. As I mentioned a moment ago, I'm going to read out a sequence, the list of countries where we find them. There are other examples of orphan structures in the world. The most blatant is the Bahamas Enterprise Entity, which was designed by the law firm Lawrence Graham in 2010 for the Bahamian government, introduced in 2011. It's a company that has no members, no beneficial interest of any kind. So the word company, it should be more in a loan than a company, because there's no one there. They are massively popular, and if you search them on Google, half the search information comes back in Russian. But those would be for another day. We haven't time to go into that kind of detail. And besides, that's just one isolated example. You could legitimately say to me, well, come on, that's hardly a global industry, that's just one small island chancing its arm with a structure that may be beneficial to those people who don't want to be beneficial. But purpose trusts, non-charitable purpose trusts, which I will explain in about 5-10 minutes' time, are universal. This is a sample of the countries or the jurisdictions where these non-charitable purpose trusts are found. It's only a sample, but it's a curious sample. The usual suspects and then surprises. The British Virgin Islands, Barbados, the Cayman Islands, the Cook Islands, Guernsey, Isle of Man, Jersey, Labuan, Mauritius, Niue, Samoa, the Turks and Caicos Islands, and then completely counterintuitively, Delaware, New Hampshire, South Dakota, and Wyoming. All this legislation is identical. It has all been introduced for the same purpose. And I'm going to come back to that list again in a little while. If we look at the roadmap during the period 2006 to 2017, leading towards, first of all, the general principles, which were 2014, and then where we are today, I could use, having broken my promise not to go back into Manx, there's a wonderful Manx expression, tre de lur. Tre de lur means there is time enough. And I normally explain that as being the same as mañana, only without the burning sense of urgency that mañana has about it. So you look at this and you think, for God's sake, get on with it. Time is money. I'm a lawyer. You don't expect to drag your clients out year after year after year. But this is what has happened with our industry as regards the revelation of beneficial ownership. And as I've put a note from myself, me to me here, it builds over 10 years to a less than thrilling climax. Start off in 2006. By the way, I'm not going to read assiduously from these notes, except the first part does have quotations, so I'm just picking up on the quotes. After that, we're just going to wing it. FATF, 2006. published The Misuse of Corporate Vehicles, Including Trust in Company Service Providers. And it said, this is where it began. Despite the important and legitimate roles corporate entities, including corporations, trust foundations and partnerships with limited liability, play in the global economy, they may under certain conditions be used for illicit purposes. Who'd have thought it? Faced with the vast scope of a general project on corporate vehicle misuse, the FATF study focuses on what is considered to be the most significant feature of their misuse, the hiding of the true beneficial owner. Great start, October 2006. Nothing further was said until October 2014. So, 8 years passes, no progress, no incentive, no heart in this project. So we come back. It's exactly the same thing. The Financial Action Task Force says corporate vehicles, companies, trust foundations, partnerships, and other types of legal persons and arrangements, well, they can be misused, and that misuse could be significantly reduced if information regarding both the legal owner and the beneficial owner, the source of corporate vehicles, assets, and its activities were readily available to the authorities. So, what? Nothing. 2006, 2014. But this is important stuff. They do say in the 2014 report, and I'll quote them because they're not fools, the FATF. They're obviously under some sort of external political pressure not to hurry. But they're not fools. They say corporate vehicles, when they say corporate vehicles, they mean the whole lot, trusts and everything else. It's just a defined term. Corporate vehicles are increasingly attractive to criminals for the purpose of disguising their identity and distancing themselves from their illicit assets. Increasing the transparency of corporate vehicles is an effective way to prevent their misuse for criminal purposes, including for the commission of offences such as money laundering, terrorism financing, corruption, tax fraud, trafficking, and organised crime-related offences. And as Liz Nelson demonstrated so clearly yesterday, gendered consequences flow from that kind of activity. And from my point of view, and it's something I put in the book in great detail, where this has gone into in huge detail, the human rights consequences of this kind of shenanigans are extremely severe. Back in 2011, the Stolen Asset Recovery, it was called the STAR Initiative of the World Bank and the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, produced something called the Puppet Masters. Just a couple of quotes. The study explains how corrupt public officials and their associates conceal their connection to ill-gotten funds by exploiting legal and institutional loopholes that allow opacity in companies, foundations, and trust-like structures. Corruption is estimated to be at least $40 billion a year to business. Every day, funds destined for schools, healthcare, and infrastructure in the world's most fragile economies are siphoned off and stashed away in the world's financial centres and tax havens. Corruption, like a disease, is eating away at the foundation of people's faith in government. It undermines the stability and security of nations. So there we are in 2011 and 2014. In comes the G20. Takes up the reins at the Brisbane Summit in 2014 in Australia. And this is the summit that creates the high-level principles on beneficial ownership, which I'll come to in just a moment. That's 2014, so it's written them. 2016, still nothing has happened. There's a pattern developing here, isn't there? The finance ministers and central bank meet and say the G20 reiterates the high priority it attaches to financial transparency and effective implementation of the standards of transparency, and so on. That was April. September 2016 in Hangzhou. The leaders of the G20 endorse it as well. Same words, won't repeat them. And now they have an action plan for 2017 to 2018. This is the plan. Not much of a plan, but it's a plan. Beneficial ownership. Transparency over beneficial ownership is critical to preventing and exposing corrupt and illicit finance. We will fully implement the FAT recommendations on transparency and beneficial ownership of legal persons and the high-level principles. Those FAT recommendations, this is my insert, actually make no mention whatsoever of the beneficial ownership avoidance mechanisms. So you've got an FATF initiative which is ineffective, and a G20 initiative which even now still hasn't come in. It's sort of inspirational, very amorphous. The problem you've got, and these are the principles, the problem you've got is that the high-level principles make the assumption that legal structures and arrangements have a beneficial owner. All to this point in today's conference, we've made the assumption that somewhere there's a beneficial owner. We've just seen fabulously detailed and brilliantly produced diagrams showing a beneficial owner. We have a Peter Sampson, supposedly the beneficial owner of that structure. He isn't. He's a discretionary beneficiary. He doesn't own anything. That is a beneficial ownership avoidance structure, classic. But those of you who are looking at it immediately said, oh yes, well his name's at the bottom of the line, he must own it. No, he doesn't. And this is the kind of duplicity we have to deal with as lawyers if we have any sense of conscience. The principles are no damn use at all. They suffer from a degree of abstraction stemming from the use of the term beneficial ownership, which they simply don't define. There's no proposal for a formula. Merely they say countries should have a definition of beneficial owner. They talk about bearer shares, nominee shareholders and nominee directors. Welcome to the 80s. And this is 2014. I gave this talk in the shortened form in Oxford in September last year at the Society of Legal Scholars. And at that point, having ranted, I was surprised that a member of the audience, an Australian gentleman, and I always do this, Bambi meets Godzilla, with me as Bambi. Australian gentleman stood up and walked out, and I thought he was taking a call. No, he was the author of the G20 Brisbane Principles, and I just insulted him to his face. So if anybody here has had a hand in, then let's leave now, because I can only cope with so much rejection. They're not high-level principles, they're stratospheric. Absolutely. I give up. I can't even make a bloody phone work. Hold on. 13 minutes. They're stratospheric. Very quickly going through the 10 principles. I'm deliberately not using slides because what's the point? They're not even worth looking at. Countries should have a definition of beneficial owner. They say, yes, but what? Have you seen the movie The Producers, where the line is, you keep saying that, but you don't say how? Countries should assess the emerging risks, obviously, that's principle number 2, and as appropriate, share with competent, this is important, paragraph 2A, shared with competent authorities and as appropriate with other jurisdictions. So that's 2A. So we've dealt with that point, sharing and caring with other jurisdictions. Effective and proportionate measures should be taken, yes, but what? Countries should identify high-risk sectors, obviously. Number 3, countries should ensure that legal persons maintain beneficial ownership, and that's accurate. That's beneficial ownership about themselves. So we've now got 3 principles, most of which are vacuous. Countries should, this is number 4, countries should ensure that competent authorities, including law enforcement and prosecutorial authorities, blah, blah, have access to that information. From point 4, from high principle 4, it's downhill all the way. Number 5, countries should ensure that trustees of express trusts maintain adequate information. Well, we had that above in number 3. Number 6, ensure that competent authorities should have access. Yeah, we had that above. That was number 4. Countries should require financial institutions to verify the beneficial ownership of their customers. Fair enough. That is unique. Countries should ensure, this is number 8, that their national authorities cooperate effectively and share information. Yep, that was 2A. Number 9, countries should support G20 efforts to combat tax evasion by ensuring that beneficial ownership of information is available to their tax authorities. Yep, that was 2A, 4 and 8. And finally, this nonsense about bearer shares. Prohibit the ongoing use of bearer shares or the taking of other effective measures for bearer shares, and restrict the number of nominee shareholders and nominee directors. Okay, now I shall stand up because I'm not really reading. This is the last part. Just to read again the list of countries where non-charitable... So it's rubbish. Complete rubbish, the G20 principles. Absolutely unusable. The test I would have as a lawyer is how the hell could I litigate that? You can't. But it was never intended to be anything more than that. They had every opportunity to make it better. Okay, the countries for non-charitable purpose trusts. Not an Isle of Man orientated conversation. BVI, Barbados, Cayman, Cook Islands, Guernsey, Isle of Man, Jersey, Labuan, Mauritius, Niue, Samoa, Turks and Caicos, Delaware, New Hampshire, South Dakota and Wyoming. Scandalous. Yesterday, we had a superb, in my professional opinion as an old bloke, superb presentation from Rasmus Corlin Christensen of the Copenhagen Business School. And he spoke about the technicization of the sort of work that we're doing. The role of professionals moving policy from societal to the legal and economic sphere. Professionals were able to shape the policy process. Well, no country on earth would invent the non-charitable purpose trust. It takes 2 minutes, except they did. It takes 2 minutes to describe. A trust is a very simple, very strong structure. It's a triangle. I give property to the trustee to hold for the beneficiary. That's all there is to a trust. Hundreds of years of case law. I give property to the trustee to hold for the beneficiary. In the purpose trust, the point I made with my right hand is cut off. There is no beneficiary. By statute, a purpose trust exists only for a non-charitable purpose. That purpose can simply be to hold the shares in a company. What I'm saying about the legislation applies across the whole list of countries that I've just read out. And there are more. New Zealand's toying with the idea at the moment. For the duration of the purpose trust, which in my country is 80 years, but that's really unimportant, no one owns the property that's in it. The legal title is in the trustees, but the trustees are not the beneficial owners. The legislation itself says there can be no beneficial interest whatsoever. So, for example, how would these be used? If you have property put into a purpose trust, it'll be there for 80 years. Whilst it's there, no one owns it. Think of a Montgolfier balloon floating by, but with an empty basket. There's no one in it for 80 years. Why would you do this? Give you an example that is not tax related, but it's a simple example. I explained it to myself, and I have used this as a self-insurance vehicle. And the example is a building company, property company, has a toxic site, a brownfield site. It doesn't want that site on balance sheet. It puts the property into a single purpose vehicle and puts the shares of the single purpose vehicle under a purpose trust. Who owns the single purpose vehicle? No one. Who owns the land? The company. Back to point one. Who owns the company? No one. Bizarre. At a certain point, and the trigger we would use in this example is when the land gets planning permission, it's no longer a brownfield site. It's no longer a risk. At that point, the trust collapses. It ends. It's very important at that point. It has ended. What do you then do with the bits and pieces you've got left? The shares in that company. The trust makes provision for the shares, the surplus assets, to go to a named or individual or company. Surprise, surprise, it's the company that would have owned them if it had wanted to. And so the single purpose vehicle slides back underneath and becomes a subsidiary. That is a legitimate, self-insuring use of non-charitable purpose trusts. What is not legitimate, we've had them since 1996, what is not legitimate is the use of those vehicles to create black holes where there is absolutely no beneficial ownership and no accountability. And they are being sold worldwide as orphan structures. That is the marketing term. If you Google it, all these damn things will come up. Usually non-charitable purpose trusts, but also, as a working example, the Bahamian Enterprise Entity, the B as it's known, the BEE. I've given you one example. In the talk, there are other examples, and I'm practically through, and there are other examples of how a non-charitable purpose trust would be used. But just to read from my conclusions, my time is now over with this talk. How do I sum up what I've said to you? Because I feel extremely passionate about this. As a human rights lawyer and a commercial lawyer, a dichotomy I manage, it's like riding two horses at the same time. The G20 high-level principles are not fit for purpose. They're a paper tiger. They lack specificity as to how to define beneficial ownership, how to gather data, how to disseminate data broadly. They take no account of beneficial ownership avoidance structures, and those structures stop the principles dead in their tracks. Lip service is being paid to these principles in the form of legislation, domestic legislation, which is itself hesitant and incomplete, and seemingly unobserved by the G20, but by no means underutilized. Legislation promoting beneficial ownership avoidance is advancing apace, and not just in the tax havens, as you saw from the list, not just in the micronations. And that advance is going unchallenged. 5 or 6 of my colleagues here in the room had heard of this structure. The rest of you spend your professional lives dealing with issues like this, but you've not been made aware of the very structure which drives a coach and four through the entire thing. They have become, the legislators who are introducing these, and I was having a conversation at lunchtime, legislators who probably haven't the faintest idea what the true purpose of this legislation is in our century, regardless of what its original inspiration was as a self-insurance vehicle. The legislators have themselves become the very agents of obscurity. And I'll leave you with that thought.